So you have actually a piece right now on The Economist about China. What do you make of what's going on economically right now in China? What do we know?
Well, right now, the Chinese economy is really not in very good shape. We know that. It's in the middle of a very big property bust. Growth has been slowing. It's slipped into deflation. There's a tremendous loss of confidence. Foreign investment has collapsed. Domestic confidence has collapsed. It feels pretty bad. And so there were a lot of signals, a lot of questions with this week coming of, would there be some sign that there'd be a big stimulus from the government to try and kind of get the economy going again? And as you said, what we got was an ambitious growth target, 5%, which is the same that they had last year. But last year, remember, China was coming out of its really strict pandemic lockdown, and there was an expectation that the economy would rebound as controls were lifted. It didn't actually rebound that much. This year, no one's quite sure how they're going to get to 5%, particularly because there was not much detail of any sort about a big stimulus package. In fact, the opposite. And so increasingly, I think there's a lot of worry about the depth of the problem that the Chinese economy is in. Is this a kind of Japan-style multi-year, perhaps multi-decade malaise? Is it something they can fix in the short term? No one really knows. And compound that with the fact that Xi Jinping has, amassed ever more power around himself. One of the really striking things about this week's gathering, and this gets into kind of Kremlinology of what's going on in China, but the premier, who traditionally gives a press conference at the end of this meeting, this time that's not going to happen. No one apparently can speak, other than, the word of Xi Jinping. And the report, the working report of what's coming for the Chinese economy has more and more references to Xi Jinping. So he's asserting a lot of control. There are ambitious targets, not clear how to get there. And this in an environment where the economy is really very weak and consumer confidence is very, very low. So it's pretty bad, actually.
No news conference is had this year, but I think they also indicate they're not going to have one until further notice. They're not going to do it in the future either.
They're not. And kind of what do you make of that? Because one of the interesting things in China, and I'm not a China expert, although I have a fantastic China team, but I go there pretty regularly. I'm going there again next month. All through the years that I've been going there, it has been true that the kind of technocratic competence of Chinese economic policymakers has been really exemplary. And if you think back, to the great financial crisis when China did a really big stimulus. They were technocratically really clear about what they needed to do to keep their economy going, to keep it strong. And there were those years of tremendous growth. Growth obviously has now slowed, but there was still a view that kind of technically they knew what to do to achieve the growth targets because, in the end, the kind of legitimacy of this regime has always hinged on the fact that it has provided for material prosperity. And the social contract, if you will, had always been you put up with an authoritarian government, you put up with all of those strictures, but you have, China is being made great again, and Chinese prosperity is rising. That's really shifted. I mean, and you see it, for example, with the high levels of unemployment amongst young people. You sense a sense of disillusionment. Young Chinese now know that they are not going to see the remarkable increase in living standards that their parents saw. So there's a sense of loss of confidence. At the same time, there's this very clear clampdown from Xi Jinping, not only amassing power around himself, but really shifting the focus towards national security, towards a great Chinese state in conflict with, or at least confrontation with the United States. That's what he's focused on. He is not I don't think he's not really interested in economics. He's very statist. He doesn't believe in stimulus. He's got a very kind of, you might even say, economically illiterate view of what the economy needs, but he's not focused on that. And so the question is all of these ingredients together, how does China actually get out of its malaise?
What does that mean we should do as investors, as readers of The Economist? What do we do? Because back in the days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union, you could pretty much avoid the Soviet Union economically. It was not that big a player globally. China is the second largest economy in the world. It's hard to say we're just not going to invest in China. We're not going to deal with China. We have to.
Well, there's two separate things here, and one which we haven't talked about yet, which is all of this is against a backdrop of very real tension between China and the US, and actually a very different approach to China in the US. I mean, much higher tariffs, much greater confrontation. I mean, I think this is one of the areas where there's the least difference between, former President Trump and President Biden. Being tough on China is one thing that unites everyone in this country. there is, if we have a President Trump, we'll certainly have much higher tariffs. Even if you have if President Biden wins, you're still not going to have a sort of big change to China policy. That means that it has become a very different environment. And so if you're a foreign investor looking at China, not only do you have all of the domestic things that we've just talked about, you have it against a backdrop of a kind of geopolitical environment where investing in China is a tricky thing to do. Remember, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, talked about a small yard with a high fence. That would be the way that the US would approach what it wants to protect from China. Well, the yard may be getting bigger and the fence may be getting higher. So what are the new kind of strictures? What are the new controls coming? So I think it's only a slight exaggeration to say that China has sort of become uninvestable for outsiders certainly in many sectors.
And finally, what about Europe? Because Europe is an alternative.
At the end of a conversation now. Oh yeah, what about Europe?
No. Well, but I'm mindful of this in part because Europe, historically, particularly Germany, has been very economically intertwined with China, has benefited from that relationship. At the same time, Europe could be an alternative destination for foreign direct investment.
Yeah, and Europe is relatively cheap now. Germany, the interesting adage about Germany, right, was that it always outsourced its security to America, its gas supply to Russia, and its market to China. Germany has a big challenge, a very big challenge, in part because it's, for a lot of its Mittelstand companies, China was the biggest market, but also because, frankly, the whole EV shift and the shift to EVs is a really, really big challenge for Germany. So Germany is itself in quite a big economic mess, and there's a kind of question of, is it capable of doing the policies that are needed to really push its growth? But there are, I think it will do, and I think Europe is, in some ways, Europe's been kind of, people have been so downbeat about Europe's prospects for such a long time that actually there are bargains to be found. There are growth areas in Europe. The big thing that I'm sure you talk about on the show the whole time, AI and how AI will kind of transform all of this. That's the bit of the wild card, because it's sort of, the US is clearly dominant right now. Can there be a quick adoption, and can there be strength in those areas in Europe? And of course, what does China do there? China is hoping and pushing for that, but that's the area where the controls from the US are really making a difference.